Oh, one other question that I had. Um, how do you pronounce your last name?
Yeah.
Yao. Okay, I just want to make sure I get that well. Right. Okay. Dr. Joanne Yao, welcome to Sustainability Now.
Thank you very much.
So why don't we begin with a brief synopsis of your book, what it's about, and why you wrote it?
Okay, yeah, so the book is titled The Ideal River. So the book is really about the creation of the ideal river, or a sense of what the perfect river ought to look like in the Western geographical imaginary. And I focused on the late 18th and 19th centuries. And this ideal river is a rational, straightened, and predictable highway for the global movement of goods, people, and ideas. So the book examines efforts to create this ideal river along three transboundary rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, and the Congo rivers. And it's done through the creation of the first international organizations in the 19th century along the Rhine and the Danube, and the failure to create a similar organization along the Congo. And I think it came at the topic in a roundabout way. So when I started my PhD project, I wanted to write a PhD on cooperation over oceans, global oceans, but
Hmm.
was quickly advised to kind of scale down the ambition of this PhD project. So I turned to rivers as a scaled down version of perhaps ocean cooperation, but actually discovered how fascinating rivers really are, both physically as natural objects, but also ideationally as spiritual places and places of the sublime where beauty intermingle with danger. So I guess I wrote the book because I found rivers to be really fascinating characters in international politics. And fascinating characters in the history of the creation of the current international order. And I wanted to really highlight to IR scholars that international society's engagement with the natural environment isn't really a recent thing that came to the fore in the late 20th century, but really rests at the heart of a Western-led modernity.
Okay. Um, well, how did you, you did your PhD at the London School of Economics, and I don't know what your background is, but how did you end up there?
Okay, so I grew up in the United States, and I became interested in international politics at the University of Chicago, where I did my undergraduate.
Hmm.
Um, and then I did my master's at Johns Hopkins SAIS with a view of working in government or international government of some sort. I spent some time working in the US government. Uh, I didn't really like it there. It was a bit too bureaucratic for me,
Where
and I
were
asked a
you?
lot of questions. Hmm?
Where were you working? Just out of
I was
curiosity.
working for the Department of Defense.
Ah, okay.
And it was a bit too bureaucratic, and I challenged authority a lot. So it wasn't the correct partnership, let's just say. So I thought, well, what else can I do? So I applied for PhD programs, and while I was waiting for answers from PhD programs, I went off to the Republic of Georgia to work for an international NGO, Care International, there for a while. And I got an offer from the London School of Economics, so I decided to go. I think otherwise I would have perhaps stayed in the NGO sector. And
Hmm.
then I got my PhD, as you said, at the London School of Economics in international relations. And I cast around for academic jobs as one does when one finishes one's PhD. And I thought, oh, I'll give myself a couple years to see if I can find something. And then if not, well, I'm sure I can find something else to do. And I got a teaching position at Durham University where I was for 2 years. And then when the opportunity came to move back to London, I took that opportunity to move to Queen Mary.
Hmm. Okay. Well, the three rivers that you write about, have what I would think of as a distinct geopolitics. And one thing we ought to remember is, of course, is that my listeners are not IR, international relations scholars. So we have to be sort of, cautious about terminology, as I'm often reminded. Anyway, distinct geopolitics, right? I mean, they run through different parts of Europe, and of course the Congo. And some of it has to do with obviously geography and geology, and some of it with borders and ideologies. I mean, can you summarize this history of geopolitics and let's just say struggle over these rivers.
Yes. So I think that's really a central point of the book, um, is that in creating or in envisioning the ideal river along each of these actual physical rivers, there's a different inflection for what the ideal river looks like, in the imaginary. Um, and you're right, it has to do with the physical characteristics of the river. So I describe how each of the rivers have different physical characteristics, which enable or present barriers to different types of politics. Um, and you're right, it's also important. What's also important for the story is the river's place, each river's place in global geopolitics, perhaps we can call it. So, for example, the Rhine, I see the Rhine as sort of an internal highway for European countries. And the Rhine, the taming of the Rhine was seen as good for the flourishing of European commerce, European political cooperation, and European civilization and progress, to help Europe overcome sort of the Teutonic insanity of its medieval past and to achieve a rational, efficient modernity. Um, and that has to do, of course, with the geopolitics of the Rhine and where it's situated in Europe, flowing through a series of European countries. And the difference between the Rhine and the Congo, I think, and the Danube is interesting in that the Danube, because it flows from the heart of Europe to the near periphery or the Near East, the river is seen as a connecting river that connects the heart of European civilization to something foreign. So it's seen as a liminal space where Europe meets the other. And then controlling the river, taming the river, signifies the control of this conduit to make sure that civilization and progress flows one direction from Europe outwards rather than chaos flowing the other direction. Um, the Congo exists outside of Europe, as you mentioned, um, in what was envisioned as a heart of darkness or a blankness on the map. So it was seen very much as an imperial river. Um, and the taming of the Congo was about imposing a commercial rationality and imposing all the good things about European civilization on this conceptually empty space where no legitimate institutions existed before, or was seen as no legitimate institutions.
And what were the consequences of that? I mean, this is in the context, right, of the struggle over, partitioning Africa, right? Um,
Yes,
what
so oh, sorry. So the context of course, for the Congo, the consequences of imposing a European model developed along the Rhine and the Congo onto what they thought was a conceptually empty space was rejection of this international organization that it never took off, right? So the Congo River Commission was supposed to be constituted through the 1885 Berlin Conference, where the partition, well, I might say, the scramble for Africa really
right?
took off. Um, and there was supposed, but if you look at the conference, the purposes of the conference wasn't to divide Africa. The purposes of the conference was actually to institute some sort of order so there wouldn't be war amongst the parties fighting for Africa. And so the Congo Commission was part of that deal where there was supposed to be a commission, an ordered, rational way of taming this river, where everything didn't descend into war, right? In terms of the who has what, who owns what piece of Africa. Um, and
It
sorry.
sounds, I mean, when you talk about it that way, talk about imposing order on nature, it sounds, and pardon to any of my listeners whom I might insult, it sounds very Teutonic and German, right? I mean, in the sense of, or even Prussian. Now, I know
Yeah.
Prussia doesn't enter the scene until later in the 19th century, but is this? I mean, who was the most influential party or country, especially in Europe, since the Germans didn't get much of Africa, as I recall. They got
Mhm.
Southwest Africa and I think Rwanda, right? Not Rwanda, Burundi, I think it was. Or anyway, it doesn't matter. Um,
So I guess I don't in my research I don't really distinguish between the different European countries and sort
Okay.
of the different inflections um, that each perhaps European culture might have had and meanings behind the river. I was very much looking for more similarities.
Hmm.
Um, and so the sources I rely on are perhaps primarily British because of the language I speak and where I'm situated.
Yeah.
Um, but the British were a big part of discussing the imposition of a river commission of some sort on the
Mm.
Congo. The French were very much part of the conversation as well, and the French also have a history of controlling water in ways. For example, if we think about Versailles and the grand fountains of Versailles, it's all about controlling water and demonstrating how the control of water also bleeds into other aspects of state control.
Yeah, I want to come back to some of that later about water. Um, One of the things that you talk about in the book is about sovereignty over rivers, right? Is that
Mhm.
the laws of sovereignty, which is very much like the law of capture in domestic politics. I mean, it's, if you have the banks, you own it and you control it, right? And on the other hand, as you mentioned, commerce was a very important factor. So you're talking there about sovereignty as an obstacle to, in a sense, turning the river into a single, oh, I don't know, a single entity, a single stream, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. And how did that work? I mean, there were tolls, these kinds of tolls and chains and that sort of image. How was that dealt with?
I guess and I think that aspect of the book focuses specifically on the Rhine
Uh-huh.
and sort of the history of Teutonic tolls levied along important parts of the river. Historically, the German states were broken down into small principalities along the river, and this gave a chance for every prince to kind of levy tolls across the river. Similar dynamics along the Danube. Uh, but for the most part, I talk about how this um, levying of tolls along the Rhine made it really an inefficient economic highway. So inefficient, there were songs written about this, how many tolls were being levied along the Rhine, and so inefficient that people were transporting their goods over land, which is not as efficient, but given the number of tolls and the number of sort of stops you had to make along the way, um, it was more efficient to just cart things over land. So these tolls along the river, sure, it was an exercise of the prince's right to levy these tolls. It also kind of speaks to a meaning of the river as belonging to certain princes as part of their land that they could do with as they wish. And the meaning of that shifts throughout my story. So if the meaning of that at the very beginning is private ownership by the princes as part of their land to do with what they wish, then the meaning of these transboundary rivers start shifting to, well, shouldn't everybody have the right to use this transboundary river? The river doesn't belong to you because it flows through your land, but it starts somewhere else and it goes somewhere else, right? And so the breaking down of these tolls, the sitting down and saying, well, we don't, these tolls are not efficient, and having an outside power impose that. So there is a story here of hegemony and having an outside power, whether that's Napoleon or whether that's the settlement at 1815 coming in and saying, we're going to get rid of these tolls because these tolls are not good for European commerce and they're not good for us morally if we want to be cooperative, civilized, progressive people.
An economist would simply say that this was, um, the recognition that separate tolls, as you say, were inefficient, right? And I mean, the princes would come to realize that they would make more money if they didn't impose the tolls, right? Because it cut back on
Yeah.
business. But on the other hand, the way you talk about it or you write about it, sounds much more like power politics in a sense, where yes, commerce is important, but by the same token, uh, domination of some sort, even if it's not, territorial domination, is important. I mean, does that seem accurate to you, or am I just projecting?
Yeah, I think I in the book I emphasize kind of the intertwining of two logics, both the economic logic and what I call moral logic. So perhaps maybe not power politics, but
Ah,
there's a moral good in taming the river that's just as important and intertwined in the economic good, because generating more economic wealth is a good not just in itself, but because it was seen as morally progressive. So that I
but
think what's important here, ideas of progress really
okay.
driving the story for me.
Okay. Well, I was just gonna interject that, right? I mean, the moral case sounds very much like a utilitarian case too, which means, we're sort of back at economics in that case, in that
Mhm.
instance, right? But no, I've forgotten what you were just what you were just talking about. That's what happens when you get older. Um, One of the things that I wrote to you about was this link between nationalism and economic development with rivers at their center. And you don't really talk about that precisely, but the sort of the will to develop, to progress, was progress, right? The development is progress, right? And progress serves the nation. And again, there's this kind of I don't know, contradiction, right? That to develop the river, you have to have some degree of control. I mean, we see this nowadays, right, with the
Mhm.
Nile and the dams on the Nile, right? That I think it's Sudan, uh,
Ethiopia,
Ethiopia controls now the water, the headwaters of the
the
Nile.
Grand Renaissance Dam that they've built,
Right,
it's
right,
in
and
Ethiopia.
and and Egypt suffers as a result, or at least it claims it suffers. Right, and of course, in both cases, it's about the nation, right? National development. I mean, as much as it is about economic efficiency or anything else. And um, anyway, it's a theme that has sort of long fascinated me, as I mentioned. Um, one of the sections of your book is called Megadams and Concrete Temples, and I wonder if you would talk about temples, megadams and temples, because I mean it's a very intriguing combination.
Yeah, I guess I haven't thought long and hard about this, but big dams are like temples because I think they're built to inspire awe, and they're built to inspire awe for an idea, the same way temples are through monumental architecture. It's the same way as, you build a monumental temple, it draws the eye upwards to something higher, signifying a higher ideal. And it presents a stage for different sorts of performances to take place.
Hmm.
They're costly, right? Just like, if you build a grand temple, they're costly in the same way, but also framed as necessary to advance the values and aims of whatever society is building them, whether that be sort of the glory of God or the glory of modernity in the case of these monumental temples but sorry, monumental dams. So for dams, the ideal that's being reached for as your eye is drawn upwards is the desirability of development along a certain modern conception of what development ought to be, and a certain narrative of how to get there.
Hmm. Well, I have a question for you to think about, and that is, of course, big dams are falling out of favor, right?
Yes.
And does that say anything about the obsolescence of temples? If you don't want to answer
Hmm.
the question, just say I don't know. But
Well, I think that's interesting. Something interesting to chew on. Uh, so maybe we're entering an era of post-modernity. So if these temples are built for modernity, to worship on the altar of modernity, then perhaps we're entering a phase where that ideal no longer holds. But there are places in the world, as you mentioned, the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam,
right, right.
where it is still being lauded as this amazing things that's going to help this country develop in the future.
Yeah, and as they say, we will see, right? It's too soon to
Yeah,
tell, right?
yeah,
Well, let's take a break right now. Okay.
yeah.
You're listening to Sustainability Now. I'm Ronnie Lipschitz, the host of the show, and my guest today is Dr. Joanne Yao, who has written a book called The Ideal River. And we've been talking about rivers in Europe, in particular the three rivers she focused on in her book, the Rhine, the Danube, and the Congo. But it seems to me that some of the things that you talk about apply to rivers everywhere. I mean, there is this whole sort of mixed mixed vision of what rivers are, and of course water, which is so integral to having a river. Um, and you actually wrote in your acknowledgments the following: can the history of the river be disentangled from the societies that have dreamed along its banks, bathed in its waters, and engineered its shorelines? I found that an extremely sort of evocative sentence, which combines the kind of the romantic and imaginary with the concrete and mechanical. And how can you expand on how you think about these connections?
Yeah, so I think that aspect is very central to the way I think about the relationship between rivers and society, that it's entangled and it's co-constituted, right? So in that way in which um, we don't have imaginaries about what the ideal river is without some engagement with actual rivers, right? So my geographical imaginaries don't come out of somebody sitting in their homes in a room just dreaming of rivers, that there's always some sort of engagement in the concrete in the actual rivers that whatever person is imagining is used to, right? Whether that's the river outside or the river they traveled to, etc. And I think vice versa, that the river, what we might envision as a natural river, has always been um, sort of worked on by human society in some way. So there's a lot of conversations perhaps about restoration of rivers, but then the big question is restoration to what? What envisioned ideal natural river are we restoring things to? And there is evidence that, you know, if you take something like a river like the Rhine, there's evidence that humans have been trying to engineer its shorelines for millions, not millions, thousands of years at least, right? That there is some effort to do this. So I guess what my book is about in the late 18th and 19th centuries is sort of the monumental scale of those projects, how those
Right.
projects are
Yeah.
scaled up in a way that sort of encompasses the international.
Yeah. And but as those things are, what does nature mean then in that context? I mean, uh, we have the
Mm.
mechanical utilitarian vision, right? The engineers and the hydrologists of the 19th century looking at these rivers and saying, boy, what a mess. We've got to get them cleaned up. And then you have the romantics, who write music and who paint paintings and who, uh, write poems about them, right? And they're both thinking about nature, right? About and of course, this is not irrelevant to the present day and the present moment. Um, how does that, again, can you sort
Yeah.
of play that one out? Because you do talk about nature in
Yeah,
there and
I
the transformation of nature. Um,
yeah, I think very much sort of that romantic vision and the utilitarian vision. Sure, they're about sort of engagement with the material outside of themselves, what they see in the world. But they're also about themselves. So that romantic vision of the river is much less about the actual river, but sort of a evocation of a certain feeling um, within human beings who see the sublime, right? So the beauty and the dangers of the river combined, and it evokes something which brings up um, sort of the essence of the human soul. So it is sort of an engagement with the river, but it's also mixed up with an internal gaze, if you will. And I think the utilitarian version, I would argue, has similar dynamics, where you are engaged with engineering the river, you are engaged with pushing the river this way or that way, but it is also an internal reflection of your desires for a rational, straightened river, and that an argument that this is what's good for society, this is what's good for progress. And I think that is an internal inflection as well as sort of an engagement with the physical.
Well, I mean, it's also a reflection of the Enlightenment desire to command nature, right? What
Yep.
is it? The I can't even remember who it was who said it, right? Uh, anyway, it doesn't. There's a line about nature to be controlled must be obeyed, or something to that effect. And I think it was one of the Bacons who said it, or anyway. Um, but again, it's part of that sort of drive to understand the world, right? And to be able not
Mhm.
only to explain it, but also to manage it. Which again is something that has changed, at least in some societies, right? It's no longer, I mean, the notion of wild rivers. Um,
Mhm.
we have a nascent movement to drain Hetch Hetchy, which provides water, which is a reservoir which provides water to San Francisco, which John Muir thought one of the most beautiful canyons in the Sierra Nevada. Of course, the city of San Francisco is aghast at that idea because where would we get water, right?
Mhm.
And I also, I mean, I have some questions here about water scarcity. I know it's kind of outside of your remit. Um, but we've sort of moved away, at least Western society has moved away from this, command of nature idea, at least in some respects.
Mm.
Yeah, I know. You're looking doubtful.
I am looking doubtful. I think in some ways, and I think I mentioned in my conclusion, and in some ways we have learned from some of these mistakes of the past. And in my book, I very much mention sort of the negative consequences, if you will, of some of these monumental engineering projects. That, we thought that straightening the river would fix the flooding, and maybe it didn't. Maybe it just, ushered the flooding downriver rather than, locating it upriver and made it worse, in fact, um, in a lot of instances. And so in in that way, maybe we've learned from our mistakes. Maybe we're tending towards smaller dams rather than these big monumental dams. That maybe a rejection of this mastery idea. There is talk of wilding or rewilding, keeping things wild or rewilding, wilderness and nature. But on the other hand, I do think there is still, a lot going on in terms of the conquest of nature. This idea of mastery going into space, colonizing the moon, colonizing Mars. If we think about geoengineering, this idea that we can stave off climate change by creating a shield around the Earth, all of these ideas are still very alive and still seen as perhaps desirable policy options going forward. So on the one hand, I do think there is, it may be too early to tell, there is kind of movement away from mastery, or at least questioning the Enlightenment confidence in mastery. But on the other hand, I do think these projects of mastery are still out there, that we are still quite confident that as long as we try hard enough and build good enough engineering models or good enough technology, that we can control nature.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, of course, absolutely right. I mean, we still have this struggle between technology on the one hand, right, as the solution to all of our problems, and changes in human behavior and social behavior as the other. And I mean, I'm sort of curious, and maybe you ran into this in doing your research and in the archives. Um, was there opposition to what was being done to the rivers, to the Rhine and the Danube? I mean, not just the poets and artists, but was there
Mhm.
wider spread? Because of course, anytime you try and tame a resource, you're also intruding on users.
Yeah.
Did you find anything like that?
Yeah, so absolutely not so much in the archival material, because a lot of the archival material I accessed focused on the diplomats, and they wouldn't have
They wouldn't have talked about
necessarily
that.
talked about it, but there was a lot of discussion about the local groups who resisted and advocated for other meanings of the river, perhaps who advocated for the river perhaps as a habitat for fish or wildlife, or as spiritual beings, and they were very much painted as these degenerative backwards people who stood in the way of progress. So, even in the first case of the Rhine, a lot of the sort of local fishermen and farmers resisted these giant engineering projects to take out the bends along the Rhine and to straighten it and deepen it. But these were just painted as backwards, yahoos who stood in the way of German progress, right? We were
Hmm.
looking forwards, they're looking backwards.
Right.
And I think that even today, that gets people who stand in the way of these big engineering projects are painted this way, that they're looking backwards, that they're not, modern in that sense.
Well, on the other hand, some people, look at them as heroes, right?
Hmm.
That I mean, we're no longer, well, again, I'm projecting backwards by saying, that particular view is no longer necessarily the only one. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
No, I would agree with you that there is a difference. And I guess what I try to bring out in my book is the way that that one particular view, and that one particular meaning of the river has been embedded in international institutions in a way that kind of gives it a leg up, perhaps, in the way we think about the world.
mm,
So, because of its dominance in the 19th century, and the 19th century being the beginnings of international organizations as we know it today, these particular ways of viewing nature, these particular ways of um, aiming for mastery, has been embedded in the way the frameworks of international politics in a way that then even now as we challenge that, as different groups, diverse points of view start to challenge that, they're running up against sort of the implicit embeddedness of those ideas.
now I wonder if one can connect that to the rise of capitalism. The idea, the will to order, we might say, right, and
Mhm.
the efficiency arguments around
Yeah.
commerce, and again in the distant past, in the year 1200 or even 1500, do you find the similar kinds of arguments about the uncontrollability of the river and the need to manage it? I don't know if you went back that far. I'm sort of curious now about that.
Yeah, so perhaps I don't really quite understand what you're getting at. The
Oh,
uncontrollability of the river and the desire to control it has has always been part of the discourse. And in my book, Within the Times, I'm talking about the dangers, both physically and metaphysically, of an uncontrolled river is very much at the center of what these projects were trying to fix.
no, I mean, I understand that. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. But how does this link to capitalism? Sorry,
Well,
what is
I'm
the
going
question?
in two directions, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, right, it's about development, national development, and the economic product. And
Hmm.
if you talk about commerce and free trade, you inevitably get to capitalism,
Hmm.
right? And but I'm now curious about historically, before the Enlightenment, before
Yeah.
the capacity. I mean, rivers were engineered, right, as you pointed out, for thousands of
Yeah.
years. Um, why they were engineered in that way, what was the goal? Productivity or power, right? The power of the sovereign to basically control the water, right? I mean, you get back to the hydrological states argument.
Mm.
God, I can't remember. I used to be
Wittfogel.
able, Whitfogel, right? I used to be able to remember these kinds of things. Um,
Yeah, no, it's all right.
um, but the idea of wild nature, was it, do you know whether it existed? The idea that nature had to be tamed. Um, I mean, I know we have a whole sort of story, right, with Lynn White
Yeah.
talking about the origins of our depredations of nature in early Christianity, right, or even in the Bible,
Hmm.
in the Old
Hmm.
Testament, right? But
Yeah.
um,
I guess I don't really go back that
you
far
don't
to
go
look
back far
beyond.
enough. Yeah,
So my starting point is the Renaissance of the Enlightenment, a
yeah,
certain way of I guess in the story I start with at the very beginning, when we look at Machiavelli and Leonardo da Vinci
uh-huh.
um trying to have their engineering projects uh there there was a lot of pushback saying, well, you can't do this to a river. Only God has the right to control a river. Only God can part the seas.
Yeah,
Only God can divert a
where
river.
where do
So
we
what
hear
are you
that
doing?
nowadays? Yes.
Yeah. The hubris of you guys thinking you can Even though you guys are two of the geniuses of the world, even you thinking you can divert a river, what hubris, right? But like the Enlightenment thinking was a rejection of that. And it's like,
Hmm.
okay, but we can
Hmm.
do it, and we're going to show you, right? So perhaps there was a lot more skepticism before the Enlightenment that it was man's place to do these engineering projects to change the entire flow of a river, um, and that it was very arrogant. Um, I, I yeah, I can sense that, but I haven't done much research into that.
No, I understand, and I'm being unfair partly in asking you that question. I was just going to think, does Nietzsche have any views on rivers uh,
No idea.
in relationship to what you just talked about, right? About the death of God as the manager or the controller of waterways, right? Um, anyway, there's another dissertation to be written.
Yeah, the
Listen,
death of God
and
and
we've got about
rivers.
4 minutes left, and I wanted to go off topic, if that's okay with you,
Mhm.
about rivers and water in general. And since you've got this, deep knowledge now of 19th century European politics, um, there's this constant theme about countries fighting over rivers, going to war over rivers. I've always sort of regarded that as a questionable proposition. Um, and it certainly is much more exciting than talking about water conservation or even commerce, right? When in doing your research, I mean, what do you come to any conclusions about that particular proposition?
Yeah, I think within, I guess, scholarship on shared water, transboundary water, and transboundary rivers, there is the sense water wars versus water peace, right? So does shared water lead to conflict because a scarcity of water means it's such a valuable resource that you would fight over this? Or is water so elemental to the survival of human beings that shared water actually leads to recognition of common humanity and cooperation and peace? So, I mean, I think that debate is alive in the literature. Certainly, places like you mentioned the Nile. Egyptian leaders are prone to saber rattling about um, their readiness to fight over the waters of the Nile. But if you look at the long history of shared fresh water, um, especially through the database, there's a database, I think it's Oregon State's Transboundary Freshwater Disputes database. Um, there's people who've done research into this database point out there's surprisingly few instances, actually, of shared water leading to armed conflict in the way we might imagine if we read the headlines. So there are many examples historically, I think, of shared water really leading to cooperation, surprising cooperation, perhaps. For example, the Aral Basin and the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Jordan, places where state actors are not really known for getting along with each other, but has
Mhm.
seen a history of cooperation over these rivers. But I do think for me, at least in doing the research, it's important not to think about cooperation and conflict as sort of opposite states that exist separately, at least in international politics, but I guess in domestic politics as well. So both dynamics might be at play at the same time. Two actors might cooperate and be in conflict at the same time. We really shouldn't see them as either or. Both might be there. But I think also the important thing, at least for the argument in my book, is that we should question cooperation as an ultimate good. Because when we have this dichotomy of water wars versus water cooperation, water peace, obviously one is better than the other morally. But if you look at an example like the Aral Sea, um, there is impressive international cooperation among the states over sharing of fresh water, but it is the success of that cooperation that has led to environmental degradation and kind of the using up of all the water. They're so good at sharing that they've used up all the water, and the Aral Sea has really shrunk. So cooperation is often kind of lauded as is the end goal of international politics, but hopefully my book questions that a bit. That yes, cooperation might be better than death and destruction, but also is cooperation really the end goal here, or should we be adding something else to that?
I guess might one call up the example of the Colorado River here in the,
Mhm.
in the Southwest, which I think there's just been an executive order issued again, telling the individual states to behave nicely, to play nicely over dividing the water. Um,
Yeah.
it's a kind of an archetype. Um, what's your next project about?
The next project is going to bring together Antarctic exploration and early outer space exploration and thinking about the role of science in creating international cooperation and striving for what I call epistemic completion. So, this idea that you can see the globe in its entirety. And in order to do that, you need to see the globe from all different places.
That sounds terribly romantic. Is
Well, it's going to take down the romanticism. I mean, again, I think
Well, I
part of
mean,
this is about,
the blue marble kind of notion,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah,
It's about
yeah.
deconstructing that and questioning that and seeing what that blue marble concept hides when we see it as this beautiful,
Mm,
integrated, romantic whole.
mhm. Okay, well, I
It
look
hides a
forward.
lot of things,
It
is
does.
my argument.
Well, I look forward to seeing it, and I want to thank you so much, Joanne, for being my guest on Sustainability Now.
Well, thank you very much for having me.